Okay. All right, everybody. Hi. Everybody's here. This is Steve Charman. He taught me Intro to Social Psych. We did research together on eyewitness memory. I guess you can tell them more about yourself when you'd like, but he's going to be talking about pseudoscience and science and the nature of science, as it says. He's also going to be, I guess, discussing, as we've been talking about reason and doubt and justification, sort of how these all consolidate within the field of science and looking at pseudoscience. A little bit. I think, sort of. Okay, cool. And I'll just let him take it away.
All right, thanks. You guys come from all different areas, right? We call it. So is anyone a psych major here? Show of hands, just a couple people. And is anyone a physics major?
Oh, mine.
Or mine, whatever. If you're okay, so a few people. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about sort of the nature of science and sort of trying to demarcate a little bit the difference between science and pseudoscience. And in doing so, I'm going to talk a little bit about psychology and a little bit about physics as well. Now, I'm a psychologist by training, so that's kind of my expertise. So I have that pretty well down. The physics stuff, I just kind of have a kind of a layperson's interest, I guess. And so if I make mistakes, the physics majors in this audience can correct me, hopefully. By the way, I don't need to make this like a lecture format where I just talk to you guys, so feel free to interject and talk, and I could probably talk the whole time if you want me to, but I'm more than happy to have a conversation and things. So feel free to interrupt and as I go along here. Got some data from a poll. This poll was done in 2001. It's been redone, I think, in 2011, and I just looked that up yesterday or this morning, and I wanted to put the new numbers in here, but I didn't quite have the chance. But they're pretty close to this, so I just kind of left this one in for now. And what the poll was looking at was a number of pseudoscientific beliefs that are listed on the left and the percentage of people who believed in them on the right. And just going down the list, and they're listed in order from the most percentage of people who believe in them to the least. And you can see that you've got things like about 50% of people, this is done in America, so about 50% of Americans believe in, for instance, ESP. About a third of people believe that aliens have visited Earth. About a quarter of people believe in reincarnation. Extrasensory perception. Okay, the idea that you can, there's a number of variations of it, but like read minds or things like that. Okay. So these numbers are pretty close from the last survey that was done. It fluctuates a little bit, but it's roughly the same numbers. And if you look at the percentage of people who believe in at least one pseudo-scientific or paranormal phenomenon, it's about 3/4 of people in this country do. Okay? So what I want to talk about today is what differentiates a little bit between science and pseudoscience. What is sort of the demarcating line there? In order to do so, I want to first talk about the purpose of science itself. Because I think some people are somewhat mistaken as to what science is. So I just want to briefly mention that. So if you ask people what the purpose of science is, I imagine that a lot of people would say something like in order to find out what the truth is. And what I want to argue a little bit is that that's not exactly correct. Now, I want to be clear on this, though. It's not an accident that I put a capital T on truth. Because what I would argue is that science is a way of arriving at truth with a lowercase t, but not necessarily truth with a capital T. The difference between the two is, the way I see it is this. In order to start with science, we have to assume at the very basic level that the external world is real. Okay? And I'm going to give you some examples in a second about some possibilities that are theoretically possible, and but that science would have no way of uncovering if they were possible. So you might be familiar with some of these. So if you've taken like a philosophy class or something, you might have heard about this sort of thought experiment of a brain in a vat. Solipsism, sure. The brain in the vat is this idea that because every sense that you have, your sight, your hearing, taste, everything, basically operates through your brain, right? It's just sort of electrical activity in your brain. Then theoretically what that means is that you could take a brain, put it in sort of a bath of liquid with nutrients to keep it alive, hook it up with electrodes to a supercomputer, and have that supercomputer stimulate various parts of the brain, and that would create experiences for that being, I guess. And right now, for instance, it is possible that you are not sitting in a room, but you are actually a brain in a vat that's being stimulated electrically by this computer, and it's creating this perception that you're sitting in a classroom listening to me. Now, science has no way of testing if this is the case. Okay? And that's what I mean when I say that we have no way of knowing truth at that ultimate level, but whether that's actually the case. There's other variations of the same idea. For instance, the whole movie The Matrix is sort of based on this idea, right? You guys have seen The Matrix, I'm assuming. And in that movie, of course, there is sort of this normal life, this normal world, but in fact, that's just sort of an artificially computer-constructed, an artificial world that's created by robots in the future to keep us complacent and things like that. It's not the actual level of reality. And again, science operating within that world would have no way of knowing the difference between those two things. In physics, there's even something, sort of a concept that is related to this as well. Has anyone heard of Boltzmann brains? Any of the physics? Okay. So this was sort of introduced in physics to talk about sort of more complex things. So I'm going to kind of simplify things as I have to here. And it takes a little bit of background to understand what the Boltzmann brain is. It takes at least a minimal understanding of quantum mechanics. And so let me just give you a very, very, very basic idea of what quantum mechanics is. So let's imagine, for instance, that you have a statue. Let's say the statue is holding its hand up like this. Now, inside the statue, of course, are lots of little atoms, little tiny, tiny, tiny atoms and electrons and things like that are all moving around. And at the quantum level, and when I say quantum level, I mean at the level of the very, 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 very small, the electron level, things are really jittery. Okay? Things are always moving around and more or less at random. And if you look at all the atoms, the atoms and electrons, et cetera, within the hand of this statue, there's trillions and trillions of them. But the number of electrons that are randomly moving this way is roughly equal to the number of electrons randomly moving that way, so they all basically cancel out and the hand looks stationary. But it is theoretically possible that all of those electrons and atoms within that hand in this jittery, at this jittery quantum level could all of a sudden, just by happenstance, all move this way simultaneously. And if that happened, you would see the hand on the statue move to the right. Okay? Now, it's extraordinarily unlikely, right? Extremely, extremely, extremely unlikely that'll occur because we're dealing with like trillions of these particles. But it's theoretically possible that that could happen. And similarly, just as these atoms could sort of cause this hand to move to the right all of a sudden, it's also possible, or we know that in deep space, which we think of as a vacuum. In fact, if you go small enough, there's little particles that are popping in and out of existence all the time. And it's also possible that if you get enough of these particles in the exact right orientation that just pop into existence, you can actually create what's called a Boltzmann brain, which you can kind of envision as sort of a free-floating brain in space that just pops into existence for a moment. Okay? That's not ruled out by the laws of physics. Okay? Now, if it happens that that brain pops into existence and it just so happens to have the exact sort of setup that your brain has, then that would mean that you would be just a disembodied brain in space, basically, created with all of the memories that you currently have, with all the sensations that you're currently having. And so what that means is that it's theoretically possible that you are not in this room right now, but you're a brain in space that just popped into existence out of this quantum foam, I call it, and that you're just, because of the random, or that setup of that brain that popped into existence, you're having this experience of being in a classroom, but you may not actually be here. Okay, so there's actually a concept in physics for that. Okay, science can't tell between whether that's true or whether you're actually in this classroom. Fortunately, it doesn't matter. Okay, because science isn't about trying to get at that ultimate level of truth. Okay? Rather, science operates within the boundaries, assuming that the external world exists. And in fact, think about it, it doesn't really matter if you're part of the matrix or not, right? Your life is identical if you exist in this reality, or if you just believe that you exist in reality, but at the ultimate level, you're actually being kept alive by these machines. And this is just the matrix. It doesn't, they're identical phenomena, right? And so at some level, it doesn't really matter which of those is the actual ultimate truth. What science is interested in, though, is at the level at which we are, and the reality that we exist, that exists around us here, at finding accurate truth claims about the world. And I would argue that there's a couple major purposes of science that go hand in hand. The first one is that it allows us to be less wrong. Okay? What I mean by that is that science isn't technically about coming up with the right theories. In fact, some philosophers of science would argue that none of our scientific theories are technically right, but the theories that we come up with and that we refine over time are less and less wrong. So we get closer and closer and closer to the truth. For instance, let me give you an example. Okay? The question is this: what is the shape of the Earth? Now, if you go back far enough in time, thousands of years ago, and you ask people this question, some people might say, well, the Earth is flat. Okay. Now, that's surprisingly pretty close to true. It is pretty flat for the most part. There's a tiny curvature to it, and over big enough distances, that curvature adds up and it forms kind of a sphere, close to a sphere. Okay? So flat actually isn't that wrong, but it's definitely wrong. So fast forward a little bit in time, and then people started to say, well, the Earth isn't flat. In fact, it's a sphere. Right? Well, it turns out that the Earth isn't a sphere either. Okay? In other words, it's not perfectly round in 3 dimensions. It turns out because of the rotation of the Earth, it's a little flatter on the poles and it bulges at the equator. So the idea that the Earth is a sphere is also wrong, but it's less wrong than the idea that the Earth is flat. And so the new idea is that this Earth is what's called an oblate spheroid, okay, which is flattened at the poles and wide at the equator. That's wrong as well. Okay? Partly because some really detailed analysis shows that the bulge in the southern hemisphere is a little bit bigger than the bulge in the northern hemisphere, which technically makes the Earth more like a bit of a pear shape almost. Okay? And as we learn more and more and more about the Earth, we change, we revise our ideas about the shape of the Earth, right? Now, all of these ideas are wrong, but all wrong ideas are not the same. Some ideas are wronger than others. And science is a way of improving upon that and becoming less and less wrong as we progress. Okay? So I think people tend to think it's sort of a way of arriving at the truth. I tend to think of it as a way of being less wrong over time. We see the same thing if you look at Newtonian versus Einsteinian physics. Okay, now Newtonian physics, Newton described a series of laws that describe gravity and things like that. And for a few hundred years, that was sort of assumed to be how the universe operates until Einstein comes along and ruins the fun and basically says that space is much different than we tend to think of it, that it's curved. Space-time is curved is what we say. So for instance, any object of mass curves the 4-dimensional space-time around it. Okay? That's different than what Newton said. So Newtonian physics is technically wrong, but it did a damn good job at predicting the motion of objects and still does a pretty damn good job till today. Okay? Einsteinian physics tends to differ from Newtonian physics when you are talking about things like really traveling at really high velocities. So as you approach the speed of light, for instance, time slows down. You get heavier the faster you go. And your length in the direction of motion tends to contract as you go faster as well. Now, nothing in Newtonian physics predicts this, but it's okay because we're never moving at close to the speed of light, right? So it didn't really matter. But Einstein came along and basically showed that Newtonian physics is wrong. So now we have Einsteinian physics to describe gravity, right? Well, it turns out that that is probably wrong as well somehow. And the reason I say that is because when you take 2 of the biggest theories in physics, which is theory of general relativity, and you take quantum mechanics, which I mentioned before, right? Looking at things at the very small level. If you try to reconcile those 2 theories together, it doesn't work. Now, within their own domain, relativity theory makes some very specific predictions, every single one of which that we've been able to test has been consistent with that theory. We've never been able to show a result that doesn't conform to general relativity. And same thing at the quantum level. Quantum mechanics makes a bunch of predictions, very accurate predictions that we can test, and they all seem to be correct as well. But when you try to merge those 2 theories together, they don't play nice, okay? Which means there's something wrong with one or both of those theories, right? But we don't know what it is. But that doesn't mean that Einsteinian physics, we just throw it out, right? Because it's less wrong than Newtonian physics. In fact, one of the big issues in theoretical physics today is trying to come up with a theory that reconciles general relativity and quantum mechanics. And the leading contender for that is string theory, which you might have heard in various places. Okay? So I think science is a process of being less wrong over time. And by being less wrong over time, what that means is that it allows us to explain and to predict things better and better. Okay? Now, of course, we can use science to explain things that happened in the past. But we can kind of always come up with a theory to explain what's happened in the past. What's more important for a scientific theory is to be able to predict things that are occurring in the future. So for instance, when Einstein came out with general relativity, that theory made a number of predictions, one of them being that light gets bent around heavy objects like the sun or stars in general. And people were able to eventually test that prediction, and and the extent to which light bent conformed exactly with the predictions of general relativity. Okay. In science, we want to be able to predict things in the future, right? It's not just a matter of explaining what's happened in the past, because science is ultimately pragmatic. It's useful. The ultimate purpose of science, you could say, is not really to uncover the truth, but to be useful to us. It allows us to predict things, to develop technologies, et cetera, et cetera. In being able to predict something that occurs in the future, what you need are scientific theories. Okay? In other words, if I let go of my phone, everyone in this room knows what's going to happen, right? It's going to fall to the ground. But how do you know that? I mean, after all, you've never seen this phone dropped from this height in this exact spot. So how are you able to make that prediction? Well, the only way you're able to make that prediction is because you have, at some implicit level, a theory of what gravity is. Okay? A theory is just this conceptual framework, just to clear up any misconceptions in case there's any confusion. The way that we use theory in day-to-day life, meaning a hunch or a guess, is not how scientists use the word theory. The word theory in science means a conceptual framework that explains how things are related to one another and allows us to make predictions in the future. So our theory of gravity explains sort of why my iPhone is attracted to the Earth and what's going to happen if I let go of it. And so in order to predict things, which is really kind of the ultimate goal, or one of the ultimate goals of science, we need these scientific theories. And in fact, scientific theories are sort of the almost the pinnacle, I guess, in the sense that they are more important than the facts that we create our theories around. Okay? It is a fact that if I drop this, it'll fall to the table, but it's the theory that explains why that's the case, and really that's what we're striving for in science, is to develop these scientific theories that allow us to explain things that happened in the past and allow us to predict things that are going to happen in the future. One of the common misconceptions when I sort of teach some of these basic ideas in my undergraduate classes is that scientists prove things, and I want to disabuse you of that notion, because in science we never prove things. Okay? The word proof is something that we can use in math. It's not something we use in science. The reason for that is because no matter how strong our theories are, we have a really strong theory of gravity, I don't know if the next time I let go of this phone, it's going to float in the air. Okay? Now, I doubt that's going to happen, but if it did, it would immediately falsify our theory of gravity. It would contradict that theory. So we never know, no matter how many observations we make, we never know whether the next observation is going to disconfirm our theories. So we never prove theories true. And this is why partly one of the points of science is that we want to be less and less wrong, not that we prove things true. Okay? So scientific theories get stronger over time, not because we prove them true, but because no matter how much effort we spend, we cannot prove them false. Okay? That's how a theory in science develops over time. We test predictions that it makes, and if we find that the results don't match with its predictions, it's proven false, right? If we find that our observations are consistent with the predictions, it doesn't prove the theory true, but we just failed to prove it false. And so repeatedly failing to prove a theory false makes a theory stronger. So what is science itself? There's sort of a number of... The idea of science, it's a little bit more fluid, I think, than people often tend to think. This is sort of how I tend to define it, which is a system of investigating the world that removes as much of our bias as possible. I want to spend a few minutes talking about this bias, okay? Because we are biased in multiple ways. Could you actually get the light here? I want to demonstrate some ways that our brains lie to us. Now, that's sort of a weird way to say it because we are our brains. So what this means is that we're lying to ourselves in a sense, right? So here's what I want you to do. For this picture, I want you to stare at the black dot in the middle of it. Don't move your eyes. Keep your eyes on that black dot. I'll allow you to do that for a little bit. And in a second, I'm going to change the image. And when I change the image, I want you to keep staring at the black dot. Don't move your eyes, okay? Okay, so keep staring at that black dot. Don't move your eyes. And now move your eyes. Okay. So I'm glad I got that reaction. That means you experienced it. Okay. It's kind of a cool experience, right? When you looked at this image, when you're still staring at that dot, it was in color, and you believed that that color existed out there, right? And then when you moved your eyes, it broke the illusion. You realized the picture's in black and white. Now, the reason for this goes back to the physiology of how eyes work and how vision works, and it's a little bit too much for me to get into now. But the point I'm trying to make right now is that your perceptions of things that are out there in the real world don't always translate to reality. The reason that occurs is because your brain is tricking you. Your brain is lying to you in a sense. Okay? In fact, your brain lies to you in many other ways as well. Okay. So if you look at this, you've got a series of bands that go from dark to light, left to right, right? Now, if you look at any individual band, you can probably see it easiest maybe with this one right there. The very left edge of that band, stand up, so right here, should appear lighter to you than the part right here. Okay? It's a little bit darker. But in fact, that whole band is the exact same color. Your brain is lying to you again. Okay? You don't believe me? I could prove it. Well, I have to play around. But if you put like stuff over the other bars, I could prove that that's actually a solid color. Okay, so you have to kind of take my word for it. But I can allow you to do it if you want to come up here, and I can put my hands over. This is your brain lying to you again. Your brain is doing this to emphasize the contrast. Okay, might be a little difficult to do it that way, but okay. But what you're seeing doesn't actually exist in the picture. Your brain is creating that image. Okay. At first glance, these lines should appear to slope a little bit, but in fact they're exactly parallel, and I can prove it by dropping red lines over each one and then removing the background. Okay. If you go back to it, it still looks like they slope a little bit, right? It's your brain lying to you again, right?
I like optical illusions.
They're fun. How about this one? Look at the line AB, the line CD. Turns out that those lines are the exact same length. But no one can perceive it that way, right? It looks like AB is way longer than CD, right? But I'll prove it again. Drop lines. I'll take away the background. Then I'll rotate this line around. The exact same length. And even though you know that, you still can't see it when you go back, right? Your brain is so good at lying to you, you can't override it even. Okay, or take these two tables. Oh, there's still better ones to come, I think. These two tables have the exact same dimensions. And I'll prove it again.
I can't handle this.
Put a red rectangle at the top of that table, and I rotate it and slide it over this table. Exactly the same. But you still can't see it. Right? Or take a look at this image. And for most people, you should tend to see it moving. But it's not actually moving. Whenever you look at any given spot, it's not moving, but on the periphery, it looks like it's moving. Then you move your eyes there, and then that stops moving, and the other periphery is moving.
Do you have the optical illusion with little black squares that are white in the middle?
No, I know what you're talking about. I don't have that one.
That's
Okay.
great.
In fact, there's a lot of images like this. Here's another one that should tend to look like it's sort of breathing a little bit. This should tend to look like it's a bunch of gears moving around. Okay. Here's a good one that you can actually make, and so you don't have to look on the screen. You can actually make this with paper and actually see this illusion yourself, and it's really kind of cool when you do. I'm going to play a little video here. You seen this?
Here's our little dragon, sitting on the window ledge. But look what happens the minute we move. His head twists and turns to follow us as we move around the room. It's all an illusion, of course. He's not really moving at all. It's a version of the hollow face illusion, but it's a very powerful effect. And not just side to side. If we move up and down, again his head cranes to follow us. But our brain has made an assumption about the structure of the dragon's head. And if we move far enough around to the side, we suddenly realize the structure is different, and the illusion fails.
So you can actually make that. You can print it off, cut it out, make it. You have to, if you do that, you have to look at it with only one eye. But I've done it, and it's really freaky because it does look like it's following you around, even though you know it's not.
I saw, literally yesterday, I saw a drawing that someone did, like a stapler, that it looks exactly like a 3D image, but it's just the way that they put it on the paper.
Kind of like this.
Yeah.
right? It only works from one perspective, so that the camera's to be set up exactly right. But it does look pretty convincingly 3D, right? Same thing, there's some people who do street art do the same sort of thing, which is actually quite impressive, right? Your brain is creating this 3D image that doesn't actually exist. Now, here are a couple of my favorites. This one's hard to believe as well. Take a look at the two squares that I'm pointing to with the arrows. Now, you know what I'm going to say, right? They're exactly the same color. If you cover them up, you end up with something that's exactly the same color. If you take it away, you can't see it, though, right? Now, those are exactly the same color, okay? It's hard to perceive, well, it's actually almost impossible to see them as the same color. And the reason is because your brain's lying to you. Your brain basically knows that when something's in the shade, it's not that dark. So it automatically corrects and makes it lighter. So you're seeing that bottom square as being lighter because your brain's automatically correcting for that shade. If you squint, you can see it more? Okay, here's one. Here, this next one I can hardly believe. I mean, I still can't believe it almost.
Next one, you said?
Next one. This one, I mean, this one too, but the next one is one of my favorites. Okay. You see this picture here? What colors do you see in this picture? Pink, green, blue, maybe a little orange in there. What if I told you that the green and the blue are the exact same color? No. They're the exact same color. Okay, if I blow that up and I put this green right next to it, what we can see is that on the bottom of the top, it blends in, right? It's the exact same color. It's one of those powerful illusions, I think, this one. I mean, if you look at this, you can do a color analysis with a computer, I think, like MS Paint or whatever it is, right? And you can look to see, and it'll show you the exact same.
Okay, you got it.
Okay. So what does this mean? It means our brains are constantly lying to us, okay? They're constantly distorting information in the real world. What we're seeing in the real world oftentimes isn't actually there, okay? I'm going to extend that even a little bit more. Now, to some degree, we sort of know this, right? I mean, you guys dream, and when you dream, you know that what you're seeing in your dream is not actually real. It's all created in your brain, right? Or if you take hallucinogens, not that I'm saying take hallucinogens, but if you did, right, and you see like these hallucinations and faces warping and colors, you know that those things aren't really in the environment, right? These are just things that are being created in your brain. But what you may not know is the extent to which your brain is creating these things. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about other sort of distortions as well. So for instance, not only do our brains lie to us in this sort of perceptual sense, but we lie to ourselves in multiple different ways. So for instance, now you have to take sort of social psychology with me to really get deeper into this. But for instance, when you are presented with ambiguous information, you have a tendency to interpret that information differently depending on your expectations or depending on your beliefs, okay? Which is why you can take an issue and show people the exact same data for it. Let's say, take data on global warming, show that to the same people, and people come to exact opposite conclusions about what that data means. Because depending on your initial expectations, your initial beliefs, your political views, etc., you will interpret that information differently. But the catch is that no one thinks that they're the ones that are being biased. So we all think it's everyone else who's being biased, but not us. And everyone thinks that. Okay? So everyone thinks everyone else is biased. In fact, we're all biased in this way. Okay? Goes deeper than that. Let me show you a YouTube video. Now this is, let me find it. This is from a show called Bullshit. Okay? With Penn and Teller. Is it gonna play? No?
Yes, medical bullshitters
Hold
prey
on.
people.
Let me see if I can get the image here.
Officially.
Okay, so what I want to show you is a little clip of the extent to which we can lie to ourselves.
Scientifically claim we can cure anything. At this stage, we can't.
Let me just skip over this.
So just to see how strong the power of suggestion really is, we spent all day at a popular mall where we set up a bunch of outrageous fake medical equipment along with our very own fake doctor who demonstrated our products to a lot of willing believers.
Well, it so happens.
Like this lady.
Tell me a little bit about what your problem is.
Oh, my problem is with my right wrist. It's something that kind of comes and goes, and it makes it hard for me to move my wrist where it's painful.
Magnet therapy, in case you didn't know, has been around for thousands of years. The idea is that the magnets attract the iron in the blood. So if you'd like to try it.
Sure. Anything that would help relieve this pain.
All right.
We started with a child's toy magnet to see how that would work.
Ooh, I do feel. Oh, it feels like there's something kind of rushing through there. A little rushing sensation.
Well, that magnet really seemed to be doing the trick. The only thing is that earlier we demagnetized all the magnets and they weren't doing diddly. Since the small magnets seemed to work so well, how would a bigger magnet do, especially a phony one made out of aluminum rain gutter?
Wow.
I'm going to put it above your hand here and start moving it, and you tell me if you feel anything. If that's stronger or...
Oh, I feel it right in here. And it is a little stronger.
Our fake big boy magnet seemed to be doing the trick, but we weren't through yet.
So let's try our magnomets.
Okay.
And these not only have magnets on the outside, as you can see, they have them sewn on the inside. See if that helps you, make it easier to do that for you.
You know something? I actually think I'm feeling some kind of relief with this magnet.
Well, the magnomets were really working, so our next product should be even more beneficial. Our very special Magno hat. Our patient gave the product a thorough workout before giving us her verdict.
I have this kind of a sensation of, maybe a little more energy.
Well, the power of suggestion was working its magic, so we wanted to know how much she'd pay for a pair of magnomets.
Magnomets like this, maybe $30 for the pair.
You know, if we worked her, she'd go 50. Meanwhile, back on the...
Okay.
I like those wristbands that they tell you, like, oh, it improves balance. No,
You're right. I actually have that later on. And the reason for this is something known as the placebo effect, if you're not familiar with this, which is that our expectations about how things influence us can actually cause us to experience that, even if there's no active ingredient or whatever, even if it's not actually working. And this works on a lot of people. For instance, if you were to buy over-the-counter sleeping pills, what color are they usually? Blue, right? You know why they're blue? They're blue because they work better if they're blue than if they're red. Okay? They work better because people associate sort of sleepiness with blue, but not with red. So if you actually give people the exact same pill but color it differently, they won't have as strong of an experience. And conversely, if you gave people a sugar pill, so basically a pill that doesn't do anything, it'll work better if it's a sleeping pill if it's blue than if it's red. But if you call it an energy pill, it'll work better if it's red than if it's blue, for instance, even though it doesn't actually have any active ingredient. So in fact, we do this all the time, and it's and this is obviously well known to scientists. And so when testing on the effect of drugs, we need ways to account for things like that. The main point is we tend to lie to ourselves an awful lot. Right? But I'll go one step further even, and I'll make the argument that a lot of what you experience, a lot of the things we take for granted don't even have an external reality independent of your conscious brain. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay. If you look at my shirt, right? The color of my shirt is blue. And we have the sort of view that the shirt has some quality of blueness to it, and yet it doesn't at all. Rather, what happens is that when light hits the shirt absorbs some of it and reflects other stuff. And that light that it reflects is a certain wavelength. And when that certain wavelength hits your eye, your brain creates the subjective experience of blue. But the shirt isn't blue in and of itself. Okay? That's your brain creating an experience for you. Similarly, and so what that means is that if I take the shirt off and put it in a drawer and close the drawer, that shirt's no longer blue because there's no conscious creature to see it. It doesn't have the quality of being blue. And similarly with sound, right? Sound is just air particles moving through the air, basically, compacting and rarefying. And it hits your eardrum, and your brain creates a sound, a subjective experience of what that actually is. But sound in and of itself doesn't exist independently of some conscious creature to interpret it. So you know the famous saying, if a tree falls in the forest, it doesn't make a sound. Well, we know the answer to that. The answer to that is no, it doesn't. It makes a noise being the actual air molecules are actually being, pushed by that tree. But unless there's an eardrum and a brain to interpret those air molecules, there's no actual sound. Okay? Or we think of it as being light in the daytime and dark at nighttime, right? But again, light and dark is just an interpretation based on the electromagnetic energy that's hitting our eyes and interpreted by our brain. So if there were no conscious creatures on Earth, it would no longer be dark at night and light in the daytime. Okay? That doesn't mean the objective reality is changing. It just means that those things, those qualities aren't inherent, aren't objective features of the environment. You are interpreting them. You are creating those experiences. Okay? Or similarly, we only view a tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum around us at all times. We don't see infrared, radio waves, or ultraviolet, things like that. There are some animals that do. Bees, for instance, can see different colors than we can. When a bee looks at a flower, it looks different than when we see that flower. It's not that either one of us is more right, it's just that we're using different information and interpreting it differently. So here's what we need. If we're going to create some method of investigating the real world, we need to create one that's independent of all of these issues, right? I mean, theoretically speaking, if we are, or practically speaking, if we come up with scientific theories, and there are aliens that we have not met, and they're looking into science as well, our theories and their theories should match, right? If we come up with general relativity, then presumably, if they were scientifically advanced enough, they would come up with general relativity, independent of the brains of the people that came up with them. So we have to have a system that transcends, in other words, the individual brains that create these subjective experiences. So maybe the best way to put it is that science isn't a body of knowledge, right? It's a way of probing the world to uncover the truth. People often think of it as sort of a collection of facts, and that's not at all what science is, right? Science is a method of investigating the world. Now, people talk about the scientific method, but really there is no scientific method in the sense of a specific set of procedures, and you do this, and you come to the truth, or you come to some. It's a little more fluid, okay, than that, more flexible than that, in other words. As long as we're applying sort of critical thinking and removing our biases in order to investigate the world, then we are, to some degree, conducting science. So what I want to do is to contrast sort of a scientific perspective on things with a pseudo-scientific perspective on things. I want to show some domains in which these two areas differ. I've got, I think, 6 listed here. And the first is that in science, what we're looking for are replicable results. Okay? In other words, if I do a study and you do the exact same study with the same methods, someone on the other side of the world does that study, and an alien in a different galaxy does that study, we should all tend to come to the same conclusions. Okay? Science is not made by individual studies. It's made by replications. And if people can replicate the same findings in different places, different cultures across time, etc., then we have more and more confidence in our scientific theories. Whereas in pseudoscience, you often find the opposite. In fact, why don't I just show you another clip from the same show, from Bullshit, on this as well. Hang on, let me just figure out. I need certain times here. Okay. This deals with Feng Shui. Okay? Feng Shui is the idea that if you rearrange your furniture, then that changes the flow of qi through your house, and that can lead to prosperity and wealth and blah, blah, blah. And so what they did is they invited separately 3 Feng Shui experts to come to this house to see what tips they would give.
Is that?
Your bedroom encompasses 2 different areas of the house.
Qatar, using secret science, determined that the placement of the bed was all wrong.
You're what we call West-type people, and your sleeping heads east. And both of you would do better sleeping head west.
I have no idea how she figured that out, but at least she's clear about it. The head of the bed needs to be on the west wall.
What I would like to recommend is that you consider moving the head of the bed against the south wall.
The south wall? I guess this is Iowa science. Different opinions are fine if you're an interior decorator. But feng shui is supposed to be a science. They all use that word. Let's ask.
You're not doing this. The science is telling you all this, right?
Exactly.
It's a very reliable and predictable way of looking at what the energy really is.
So it is a science, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, right. Before they moved on to the family room, Milan brought in an item that she just happened to have for sale.
Here we have a lovely
Scientific musical chairs with every stick of furniture that wasn't nailed down.
We moved your furniture into those very excellent areas for wealth and success.
So that's why you moved the couch in this way?
Yes.
Because my only question kind of was, now it blocks a little bit of the walkway. So I wondered if that...
We moved everything back to its original position. It was Milan's turn. Would this science show the necessity of the same drastic changes that David made? Hell no. She moved nothing. Neither did Cartar. But she did make a big deal out of the color.
In the family room, there are the big red couches, which is not really great for this part of the house. And a lot of red color is the fire element. And fire tends to be extreme. If any family member were to spend a lot of time in this room with all that red color, it could cause problems with the teeth, the mouth, the jaw, the chest area.
Wow, that's some serious stuff. But at least now we know red is bad.
You know, Andrea, this red color you chose for the living family area is absolutely perfect.
Your existing sofa is a perfect color for this room. Burgundies, reds, purples. I want this room to look like an Edwardian bordello.
All this red color even makes this part of the house more accident prone. So all that red color is not good for that particular room.
You couldn't have done better because the house energy from the front and the back actually requires red right here.
I'm hoping that sofa isn't as red as their faces once they see this show.
All right. Point made, right? No, that'd be nice, right? That'd be. Do they show them like? No, I don't think they do in that show. I know. I agree. Okay. So replicability is really important, right? I mean, think about this. If ESP existed, if people could read minds or predict the future, then why are there not more psychic lottery winners, right? Why is it if, let's say even that ESP is limited. So let's say when you're limited to the extent that if you're flipping a coin, you can guess the correct response 52% of the time instead of 50% of the time. So there's a small little effect. Well, if you went to the casino with that little tiny edge, you could take them for thousands and thousands of dollars, okay, with just that little tiny edge. Why is it then that no psychics are doing this? Why is it that they cannot replicate these findings under these conditions? Okay. This is one of the reasons why a lot of supernatural elements tend to be excluded from science, because when you're dealing with, say, something supernatural that doesn't follow certain laws, okay, then we can't hope to reproduce effects or replicate effects over time, right? Science rests on the idea that there are predictable outcomes, that there's laws or rules regulating events so that we can replicate across different times and different locations. Okay, so that's one factor that differentiates science from pseudoscience. The second factor, and I've sort of briefly mentioned this, is that in science we are aware of and implement controls meant to eliminate or at least reduce as much as possible the biases that we've been talking about, and many other biases as well, such as the placebo effect and things like that. We have controls to do that. There are many types of controls to do this. One of the most important one is double-blind testing, which means that the person doing the test, if I'm doing a medical test, for instance, not only, if I were to assign you to either receive the new drug or the old drug, for instance, you shouldn't know which of those drugs you're receiving, because if you did, that might induce the placebo effect. And not only should you not know, but I shouldn't know which drug you're getting either, because I might treat you differently depending on my knowledge of that drug. And so that's called double-blind testing. And there are many other types of controls that are implemented with the intention of reducing these types of bias. The problem is that in a lot of pseudoscience, they lack those controls. Okay, they may not even be aware of those controls. In fact, which is the one I'm showing here? Okay. And that when you implement simple controls to some of these more extraordinary claims, you find that the effect disappears. I'll show you an example here. This is... again, one more time, going to Penn and Teller here. Looking at Ouija boards.
I believe that we make
hang on a
contact
second.
with Bridget Bishop.
Okay, let me just skip it right there. Sorry.
We'd like to contact the spirit of William Frawley. Is there somebody here? You may have to get used to the board. Are you here?
Yay.
Okay, where would we know you from?
T. V.
Sweet juicy Jesus, it's working! And unlike the selling witches of Salem, these three have nothing to promote or gain from their success. How can they be getting results?
Ordinarily, when you move a hand, you're consciously aware that those hands are moving. But with the Ouija board, you're not. And that's called an ideomotor response. Lauren Pankratz, psychologist. In an ideomotor response, the awareness is bypassed and the response goes directly to the muscles. You just are convinced you are not doing anything to make that thing move. So it is very deceptive.
I was surprised that we got the planchette to start moving so quickly.
Movement was completely out of my hands, so I just went with it.
Every time it would move, I was freaked.
When people get together, it's a very powerful situation of expectation. Then you say, well, there's some outside force. There's some outside spirit.
Fred Mertz's ghost. Hard to imagine anything scarier than that. We thought we'd check to see if the spirit board would work if these participants couldn't see what they were doing. Oh yeah, and one more thing. Without our volunteers' knowledge, we turned the spirit board 180 degrees. After all, that shouldn't matter to the spirit of Fred Mertz.
Was Hollywood at its height when you were alive?
Yay. Yay? There's no yay there.
Would you still like to be alive?
Nay. Whoa! Their hands are just going back to the spots where they think the words are. What a surprise.
Well, what happens is that the individual's expectations continue to operate if they don't know that board has been moved or the letters rearranged. So the expectations have the result of the person going right back to those same letters, those same patterns.
You know, the human mind is a wonderful thing.
Stop there. All right, so see what happens here, right? People who probably use the Ouija board a lot never produce the necessary controls to see if they're actually being controlled by these external forces. And a simple control, turning the board 180 degrees and blindfolding people, reveals that this is purely a psychological phenomenon. This ideomotor effect operates in a number of different ways, but basically it leads people to actually control the planchette without realizing that they're controlling the planchette. Okay, so they're not aware they're moving it. These aren't people who are lying. These are people who feel as if it's moving on its own, not realizing they're the ones in control of it. And in fact, there's numerous pseudoscientific beliefs that are based on a similar principle, on the ideomotor effect. And one we're going to talk about shortly, something known as dowsing. Yeah. All right. And so I talked a little bit before about the theories that we come up with in science, right? And theories are really important in scientific testing. And the reason is because, or rather, these theories that we come up with have to be testable for reasons that we mentioned before, right? Because a scientific theory only gets stronger after it fails repeatedly to be disconfirmed. If you come up with a theory that can never be tested, it can never get stronger, therefore. And so it's possible to come up with scientific sounding theories that are untestable in principle. And those types of theories are simply non-scientific because we can never actually conduct a test to see if they're accurate or not. This is one of the reasons why Freudian psychology isn't really popular nowadays, because Freud came up with a number of theories about why people do what they do, but a lot of his theories were untestable. So for instance, he would have a theory that might say that, you know, our behavior reflects our underlying desires, except when we engage in the opposite of what our desires are. So what that means is that there's no behavior I could observe you to do that would conflict with any part of his theory. There's no way to test it, in other words. There's no way to test it. It can't become stronger and stronger. Okay? So in a lot of pseudoscience, they have theories that are set up to be somewhat untestable. Now it's kind of done because then they can never be proven wrong. But that's not enough. As I said, we need to be testing these theories for them to be scientific. So, for instance, I tell you that I have a dragon in my garage. Yeah.
Wait, just to get your, so is psychology considered a pseudoscience, or is because Freudian?
No, well, psychologists for the most part, the theories that Freud came up with back in the day aren't used today. He had, at a general level, some of the ideas he emphasized, the idea that that we're often driven by unconscious motivations, that applies, and lots of people study those types of unconscious motivations. But the specific theories he came up with, he wasn't a scientist, incidentally, he was a clinician. Okay, those specific theories don't sort of pass the scientific tests, and as a consequence, we don't use them today. Okay.
So psychology itself, like in terms of, there are some actual testable,
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. There are many branches of psychology that have, and everything we do is, I mean, if it's going to survive as science, it has testable ideas that we test. Sure. Okay. So let's say I have a dragon in my garage, and you correctly require some evidence before you're going to believe this, right? And this is taken from a book, The Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan, which is a great book if you want to check it out. And so you want to test my idea that I have a dragon in my garage, and so you say, well, let's go take a look at it. And I say, well, you can't see it because it's invisible. Okay, all right. Okay, well, I can't see it, but let's go and I can touch it. I can feel it, right? And I say, well, no, it's kind of like smoke. You can't actually touch it. It's incorporeal. So you can't see, you can't touch it. So you say, okay, well, let's see if we can detect its footprints. We're going to lay some flour on the ground, and we'll see if we can see some footprints come up. And I say, well, it floats in the air. Okay, so you can't do it that way. You say, well, it breathes fire, right? So we can put thermal detectors to see if it's hot in there. And I said, well, its flames are actually heatless. And every time you come up with a test for this dragon, there's something that prevents you from doing that test, right? That's exactly the point. What's the difference between there being an invisible dragon that you can't feel or can't detect and there being no dragon there whatsoever? For practical purposes, there is no difference, right? Now, it might be the case that there are these invisible dragons right here all around us at all times, but if they don't interact with the world, in other words, we can't test them, they're completely irrelevant. And that goes back to the idea that science isn't necessarily about coming to the ultimate truth, right? It comes to more, it's used more practically so that we can make predictions. And so there's no difference between there being these invisible dragons and there being no dragons whatsoever. And so we need these testable theories. Now, incidentally, I will mention that I mentioned earlier string theory, and string theory is kind of the dominant way physicists are using to try to tie together general relativity and quantum mechanics. Okay? Well, string theory is being heavily criticized by some people for being non-testable because it does make predictions, but those predictions occur at such small distances that we have no way of actually testing them right now. And so there's a debate going on among some physicists, some of them which say that string theory is a real scientific theory because in principle it's testable, and some people saying can't count as a scientific theory because if we can't test it, we can't see if it's actually accurate or not. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's in theory it's testable, but we're nowhere close to having the instrumentation necessary to do so. So the debate, that's what the debate's about, is it, does that count then as a scientific theory? There's a bit of a debate about that. Okay. A fourth sort of difference between science and pseudoscience is that scientists, and often contrary to some of the stereotypes, must be open-minded, okay, in terms of their ability or their willingness to reject disproven hypotheses. Now, this is difficult because there's a lot of psychology at play here, and a lot of this psychology sort of ensures that we are reluctant to give up our beliefs, okay? But, that being said, in order for science to progress, because we're always proving our theories wrong to some degree, we have to be willing to give up those theories. So we have to be open-minded, in other words. Whereas in a lot of pseudoscience, you find the opposite. If they have a test that leads to a failure, so if their pseudoscience predicts some event and the test shows that that isn't the case, instead of discarding their previous hypotheses, they'll often create continual excuses post hoc or after the fact for why they failed. I'll show you a little clip about this. This is from a show called The Enemies of Reason, and this is Richard Dawkins, who's a famous biologist. Some of you might have heard of him. And he's testing the idea of dowsing. And just, dowsing, people hold these dowsing rods, and a common belief is that with proper dowsing techniques, if you hold these rods, as soon as they go over water, they'll cross. So it indicates that there's water below. The problem is that a lot of these dowsers have never actually tested themselves with the proper controls. And so he set up a test with the proper controls in place.
The so-called evidence for psychic phenomena is not robust, but will-o'-the-wisp. The more we look at it, the weaker it becomes. The alleged detection of water through dowsing is not obviously ridiculous. It might work, but does it? The only way to tell is through a rigorous experiment.
How does dowsing work? That's the #1 question, and nobody can answer you. Well, I reckon I'm convinced that something is helping me to dowse. One of the earlier chaps thinks it's God.
How do you do it then? What's your principle of dowsing?
I think the question, and I expect God to respond in a way that I understand. I'm going to expect the right-hand one to point to the camera and the left-hand one straight forward.
Yeah, okay.
Look, it's following him round.
Yes. And have you done the test yet in the tent?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, and what was the result?
I was going to get 6 right, 100%.
Yeah, and what happened?
1.
So what do you make of that then?
He's having his laugh, isn't he? He loves a joke.
Yes.
You don't realise.
Do I get second goes at it?
Oh, yeah, you can have as many goes.
The psychologist Chris French thinks there may be a simpler explanation. He has devoted his career to investigating claims of the paranormal. And now he has set up this test for dowsing, a properly controlled double-blind trial. In each of these rows, just one container, chosen at random, holds a bottle of water. All the rest contain sand. Neither the dowsers nor the tester are allowed to know where the water is until the boxes are opened. So there are no unintentional giveaways.
Have another go.
Safeguards like this make the double-blind trial one of the crowning achievements of scientific reason.
Okay, put it on the end one then.
Number 6 again.
I'd say so.
Okay.
Right. What you'll typically find when you talk to dowsers is they'll give you lots and lots of anecdotal evidence, lots of stories about how they discovered a leak in their neighbour's pipes and so on and so forth. But there are always other possible explanations there.
Yes.
What we're trying to do is set up conditions which would rule out any of those other explanations. But then we get down to the very fundamental, basic issue: can the dowsers actually do what they think they can do?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's 4. I think it's 4. So shall we see how well you've done? This is sand.
In that case, I can't do this.
This is the waters in number 5. Sand again. This time, guess was bin number 3. And this time you're correct. That's water. And I bet that's sand.
Yes, well, actually, there are 2 possible ones.
Final trial, it's sand again, I'm afraid.
In that case, I'm 100% wrong again.
Well, you got 1 right out of 6, which is what we'd expect by chance. So far, they're performing pretty much in line with mean chance expectation. In other words, guesswork.
Yeah.
So no one has scored more than 2 hits out of 6.
3.
3.
The people you've been testing, do they understand why they're being put through the double-blind procedure?
I think once we've explained it to them, then they appreciate why someone who is perhaps sceptical or doubtful about their claims would see that that was necessary. What's interesting is it doesn't actually tend to dent their confidence at all.
Which suggests that they're completely sincere.
I think they are completely sincere.
Yes.
And they're typically very, very surprised when we run them through a series of trials and actually say at the end of the day, well, your performance is no better than would expect just on the basis of guesswork. And then what typically happens is they'll make up all kinds of reasons, some might say excuses, as to why they didn't pass that particular test.
I feel the whole test is wrong.
I'm shocked beyond words that this has happened. But I did say from the outset, couldn't we just sort out some grey blocks and some scaffold boards so that I can walk above it, which is what I would routinely do and I've done for 40 years.
Who knows where or what bottles were in what tubs.
That's the whole
so
point,
that
isn't
they-
it? That's the
Well,
whole
yeah,
point.
But if you understand dowsing like I do, you'll understand that everything leaves an image.
This state of denial is extraordinary. Even when confronted with hard fact, these dowsers prefer not to face up to truth, but retain their delusion.
The last guy, right? Like, in order to do dowsing, I need an image. So in other words, for dowsing to work, I need to already know where the water is, and then it works 100% of the time, right? So what happens is the same idiomotor effect I talked about with Ouija boards is occurring with dowsing. So when you hold these rods, these little tiny movements of the hands can drastically change these rods, right? So as these dowsers are walking, if they know where the water is, those little tiny movements will cause the rods to cross. They're not lying about it. It doesn't feel like they're controlling those rods, but they are effectively. Because they don't think they're the ones controlling it, it feels like an outside force, such as the water is causing something. But because they've never tested themselves with proper controls, such as the double-blind test that you saw here, they truly believe this, and they go through their life believing it. And so this one sort of disconfirmation, when you include controls, often leads them to have all these excuses. So a lot of excuses are going to be like, well, as you saw, when you induce all these controls, that makes the powers go away. So, I mean, as we induce controls that eliminate bias, your powers go away. That should suggest something. Another common one is if I'm in the presence of a skeptic, the skeptic will make my powers go away as well. So in other words, I can only be tested around other people who already believe in what I can do. So you can see how this creates a lot of problems, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, and that's it too. If you don't believe, it won't work or something, right? But the problem is the people who believe are those who experience the placebo effect, and that's why. So, oh yeah, The Secret, which is all pseudoscience throughout, from what I understand, which is the idea that if you want something hard enough, it'll come to you. Now the problem is The Secret is that there's a really pernicious aspect to it, because what that implies is that if you want something strong enough, it'll come to you. What that means is that people who didn't get what they wanted didn't want it hard enough. It's their fault. So it ends up blaming the victim, right? Well, those poor people didn't get food, they didn't want it enough, right? So there's a really negative aspects to a lot of these beliefs. Yeah.
Is that then also true for karma?
Karma?
What goes around?
Yeah. It's amazing how the people who believe in karma, which means that sort of the universe balances itself out. If you do something good, you'd be rewarded. If you do something bad, you'd be punished. The people who believe in that tend to be pretty wealthy overall, right? The poor people who are suffering, who are starving to death, don't believe in karma, right? It's the people who are pretty well-fed and wealthy and that tend to believe in it. Now, there's psychological reasons for that I don't have time to get into. But yeah, I would consider that a pseudoscientific belief as well. Okay, two more. One of maybe I think is a somewhat underappreciated aspect of science is that there is a consistency across fields. In other words, when you discover something in biology, it's not independent of physics and chemistry and psychology and everything else. Everything has to fit together, in other words, right? Whereas in pseudoscientific beliefs often tend to exist in a vacuum. So for instance, the belief in Feng Shui, which is that there's this qi that flows through the environment and affects you. Well, what is that qi? Is it a force that we have never discovered, or is it a force that already exists? We need to have, it should gel quite well with physics, what we know about physics, right? And yet it doesn't. There's no force that we know of in physics that could explain what the qi is. So you can't just look at these fields and isolate them from the rest of science, right? Same thing with ESP. If you can read someone else's mind, then what is the force or the particle that's transmitting between you and that other person? We need to understand the physics behind that. So there has to be consistency across these fields. And when you lose that consistency, so if you suggest a theory, a sort of a pseudoscientific theory, that will often have ripple effects such that in order to believe that theory, you have to discard everything we know about all these other theories. So for instance, the belief that in young earth creationism, this is the belief that the world was created about 6,000 years ago by God. If we were to believe that, we would have to abandon our knowledge of a whole bunch of other scientific areas, including geology, which looks at rocks and rock patterns, and archaeology, which shows evidence of humans prior to 6,000 years ago, and cosmology, which shows that stars that are millions of light years away, their light reaches us, which means it must have been around for at least millions of years. Physics, biology, chemistry, genetics, all of these things, all these fields would be filled with incorrect ideas if it was the case that young Earth creationism was correct. We have to throw out all these other areas as well. Yeah.
But do they necessarily have to correlate with all of them? Because, I mean, at one point they do start to...
I mean, there has to be some sort of biological correlate underlying that behavior. In fact, that's what Pablo's going to be doing, right? With looking at neuroscience, right? Which basically is looking at the parts of the brain that are more or less responsible for different experiences or behaviors. It has to be consistent with it. It can't conflict, right?
But if you were to, say, for example, take that, then there would be, like, let's say, I don't know of any actual physics part of that, or, I mean, maybe chemistry, for anyone of it. People are doing it just kind of like offhandedly, not really, conscious of that they're being manipulated to do these things, and what someone would consider a cultural level. Then how could you start implementing physics and chemistry and biology? I mean, biology is probably the easiest one to think of.
Well, yeah, and that's there's kind of this, I don't know if it's a saying, but that goes the following. It's something like, all psychology can be reduced to biology. All biology can be reduced to chemistry. All chemistry can be reduced to physics. All physics can be reduced to math, right? And so the reason why psychology and physics are difficult, because there's a few steps in between there, right? And we're barely scratching the surface on how biology affects our chemistry. That's what we're working on right now. There's a number of gaps before the physics part. But everything we know about biology has to be consistent with chemistry. Everything we know about chemistry has to be consistent with physics, right? So if everything's consistent all the way at the ladder, then as long as psychology is consistent with biology, then it's consistent with everything else down the chain as well, right?
It also can't be conflicting with physics. And so
that's the main part.
In a lot of these theories, it wouldn't be conflicting with physics. Like, there wouldn't be some, I don't know, behavioral psychological theory that says that we can, like, that matter can destroy other matter. Like, I think that's all that it means to be consistent with.
The theories that we come up with are limited by the pre-existing knowledge in other fields, right? If I came up with a theory of psychology that conflicted with biology, it can't be taken seriously unless I address how it conflicts and how I can reconcile all of that data. And there's ripple effects and all the way down the line, right? So everything has to be consistent. One of the things, just if I go back for a second, in a lot of pseudoscience, a lot of the mechanisms of how these things work either conflict with what we know about science or are left unspecified. So if you hear in the Dowsing at the beginning, the guy mentioned, like, I don't know how Dowsing works. It's just basically magic, right? And you get that a lot from people in pseudoscience, partly because they know that if they postulated a mechanism that would conflict with what we already know, so they might leave it undefined. But in science, it's usually not good enough. Almost always not good. We always want to know the mechanism by which these things work. There are some exceptions to this, and I just don't have time to get into them, but one of them is the interpretation of quantum mechanics. One of the dominant interpretations it doesn't really specify mechanism, but I can't really get into that right now just for time purposes, because I know you guys only have a few more minutes in here. So I'll talk about one last thing. There's an attitude in science among scientists. Okay, there's a sort of this negative stereotype, I think, culturally about what scientists are like they're sort of cold and calculating and everything else. In fact, and sort of close-minded to the scientific thought. And in fact, I think it's the exact opposite, that scientists have to be some of the most open-minded people that there are in order to be able to discard the wrong hypothesis and follow the path of the correct ones. Yeah.
So would you say that religion is a pseudoscience?
Sorry? That religion? Well, I wouldn't say it's a pseudoscience is sort of a belief system that has the trappings of science. So they claim to test their ideas, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas religion is based, for the most part, okay, I can't even say this. Okay, a lot of religious claims aren't scientific in nature. The existence of a God is in and of itself not a scientific question unless that God interacts with the world. As soon as it interacts with the world, it becomes a scientific question. Okay, so for instance, if the belief is that prayer helps people who are, say, recovering from an illness or injury, well, that's a testable claim. We can actually devise a test, and in fact, a few years ago they did just that. Some people looked at they assigned people to either pray for some patients, and some patients didn't get prayed for, and they looked at their outcomes later on, and they found no difference in the actual recovery. In fact, if anything, the ones that were prayed for did slightly worse than the ones who weren't. Actually, they did not. I can't remember now. I don't think they did, but I'm not sure. You know the study? Was it Templeton that did it? Templeton usually is a pro.
No, I know, which is like
Okay.
a funny thing, but
Right.
yeah, you had, I think, three groups. You had one that got prayed for and you got it, one that got
Oh,
prayed for,
that might be what it is. Right.
and one that
Didn't get prayed for.
didn't get prayed for also. So you have
Right.
two that have been prayed for, one knows, one doesn't, and one that doesn't even know anything about the study, right?
Right.
And then when they found out, and also the way they conducted the prayer was that they got their names, like his first name, and they gave it to like a group of prayers,
Mhm.
and they prayed for that name. So that was
Right.
like the ambiguous part.
Right.
Like, still, like,
Did it also matter like what God they were praying to?
Well, no, I think they were all Christian.
Yeah.
But
And then what about if the people themselves actually believe it? Like, what if you have people pray atheists, like, people pray for people who you actually do?
I mean, I guess you could say.
the whole point is the people that you pray for, the
I-
people pray better, and who
The ones that because of placebo, you mean?
Yeah,
Effects.
there's
Right.
placebo.
But the ones that didn't know.
I think the same placebo didn't get prayed for.
Right.
I think if they
Yeah.
I think the beautiful irony of it is that religion, in and of itself, is an evolutionary adaptation. And this
Well,
is
maybe.
my take
We don't know
on
for
it.
sure, but it's a hypothesis that there is, though.
My take on that's
Yeah.
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's an evolutionary adaptation so that people can, through placebo, deal with having consciousness.
Possibly.
And I think it's very, very, beautifully, poetically ironic how that becomes a thing where, in the end, very religious people end up denying something like evolution, which may have potentially led to the concept that is.
Which led to the brain. So evolution led to the brain that led to the denial of evolution.
Yeah, I just think that's poetically
Yeah.
one of the most beautiful things.
Yeah, and in fact, let me leave it there with that. Is that a lot of people claim that sort of when you look at things from the scientific view, it takes the beauty out of nature. I think it's the exact opposite. I think that understanding the psychology that we have and understanding these physical processes is much more beautiful than postulating supernatural effects here. Okay, I'm gonna end things right there. All right, no problem.